Welcome back to the Edgewater Avenue YouTube channel. Today we are making the violet one piece. This is going to be a pattern that's best if you are a confident beginner or intermediate sewer. So let's get right into it. For materials, you will need swimwear fabric. There are some larger pattern pieces in this, so I do recommend having about 1.5 yards of fabric. 1/4 inch swimwear elastic. The one that I have here is made in the United States and I do sell it on my website, so that will be linked. You'll need a cutting tool like scissors or a rotary cutter like I have here. And we will be using a seam ripper in this video. The last thing you'll need is the PDF pattern for the violet one piece, which you can get now at edgewaterav.com. Your pattern comes with 3 different pattern pieces. 2 of those are for the bottom part, the front and the back. And then there is 1 bust piece, which you're going to use for both the left and the right bust. So for the front and the back piece, you're going to want to cut 2 in each pattern piece. Here I'm using 2 different fabrics to make mine reversible style. Then like I said, there's 1 bust piece in this pattern and you're gonna want to cut a total of 4 in that pattern piece. And this pattern piece is longer than the size of my cutting mat, so you might have to move things around unless you have a giant working space. And to make this go quicker, I like to flip my fabric over and cut 2 pieces at a time. Now I'm doing this all in 1 fabric, and I'm doing that because when this top is worn, it has a bunch of ruching in the bust area, and so that tends to make the seams kind of pop over and roll a bit, especially with the tie around the neck. So I just like to use the same fabric for the lining and the outer side, but if you want to, you can definitely make the choice to use 2 different fabrics, especially ones that would go well together. Now that we have all our pieces, we can begin the process of putting everything together. And what's nice about this pattern is there's actually only a few steps to get to the end. It's just a little bit tricky because of the size of those bust pieces. So first, match fronts with fronts and backs with backs, right sides together. For the front piece, you'll want to sew and attach elastic to the leg holes as well as the waistline. For the back piece, you only want to sew and attach elastic to the leg holes at this step. You want to leave the waistline completely open. For this, I'm using a 4-thread overlock stitch, but if you don't have a serger, you can use a zigzag stitch. And if you need some help on how to sew elastic, I made an entire series answering your questions, so I'll make sure to link that. So now get your 4 bust pieces out and divide them into 2 piles. Then match each with right sides together. You should end up with 2 bust pieces, but here I'm just going to demonstrate with 1 of them. You're going to sew along every open edge except for that short, wide end at the bottom. Here I will not be attaching elastic, but that is totally up to you. And since these pieces are super long, they can be really tricky to sew. So I like to first go in with a basting stitch and just tack down my pieces before I go over it with my serger. A basting stitch is a really long straight stitch that's meant to be temporary. You use it more as a tool. It doesn't provide any sort of structural support, and it's almost like you're using it like you would pins. I do this basting stitch for every single seam that I sew, even with straps, with the front and back piece. I did it off camera. It's a great tip in order to be able to get your elastic application perfect every time. So that basting stitch is totally awesome. It just makes it easier. But just remember, since it's not the final stitch, you do need to use an overlock stitch or a zigzag stitch on top. So now all our pieces are sewn and we're just gonna focus on our bust pieces and our back piece right now. As you recall, we left that waistline open, and the reason for that is because our bust pieces are actually gonna be anchored back there. And this probably seems odd, but when I was developing this pattern, I tested out a few different ways and different angles to have those bust pieces, and the best option was putting them in the back and having them wrap around the front. So first we need to take each of our bust pieces to the right side, which will be easy because we did leave that one end open. Then the next thing I like to do before I start inserting the bust pieces is do another basting stitch. But this time, I'm just gonna sew down that open edge that we just brought our pieces out from. Again, this is just gonna make it a lot easier to manage all the fabric that's going on. Sew that thing closed with the basting stitch, but it's not gonna end up being our final stitch. So once that's done, you can insert your bust pieces inside of the waistline of the back piece. And remember, our back piece is still inside out, so here you want right sides to be together. Get your pins or clips out and place the edge of the bust piece, the one we just did that basting stitch on, against the waistline. You'll want to move those bust pieces close to the side seams, but not too close to where they interfere with the seam allowance. So I like to have mine about 1/2 inch or more in from the side seam. One thing you can do, which I'm doing here, is angle the bust pieces. The excess will eventually get cut off, but this is nice because it puts those pieces at an angle that they're already gonna be wanting to be angled towards. And here I'm actually showing you the incorrect angle. The excess should be toward the side seam, not the center. So I'll put in a graphic showing you the correct way. Just know I'm doing it wrong in this video. There are also written directions if you need a little more clarification. Our next objective is to sew across the waistline, which is going to secure in those bust pieces. But we are first going to use a basting stitch again to get everything tacked down in place before I switch on over to my serger. You might be noticing a theme here. When it comes to sewing swimwear, you really can't use a basting stitch too much. It's my #1 tip for beginners and advanced sewers. It just break up the process, make it easier for yourself. There's no need to make it harder. So that basting stitch is in, and now we're gonna switch over to the serger and sew the waistline one more time. And this time my serger knife is gonna be cutting off that excess from the bust pieces. But if you're using a zigzag stitch, you'll want to manually cut off the excess with your scissors. You'll also notice I'm attaching elastic here. I think it looks really nice and professional, and the seam isn't too bulky. But if you don't want to attach elastic, you definitely don't have to. So that completes the back piece and the whole bust piece situation. And our next step is going to be attaching in the front piece. First, make sure everything is stuffed inside your back piece. We do not want any of those bust pieces peeking out because we need access to the side seams and the gusset. Then take your front piece and bring it completely to the right side. Before I move on to the next step, I'm going to again use my basting stitch. And this time I'm going to sew closed the gusset and both side seams on that front piece. So I did that off camera, and now once that's finished, we're going to insert the front piece inside of the back piece, and we're going to align them at the side seams and the gusset. Use pins or clips as needed. And this might seem tricky since our bust pieces are very large and they're just kind of hanging out inside there, but take your time and just focus on ensuring your front piece is not twisted. Once you have everything in place, switch over to your sewing machine or serger and sew down the sides and the gusset. So for these seams, I do like to use a straight stitch on a regular sewing machine. This way I can trim the excess when I'm done, and this just yields like really smooth looking seams. But you can do this with a serger if you prefer. So everything is attached, and finally we need to take this to the right side. So get your seam ripper and rip a 1 to 2 inch hole somewhere along an existing seam. Then through this hole, you can take the entire swimsuit to the right side. The final step in all of this is finishing off that hole we just made. I like to use a straight stitch with my machine, but you can also do an invisible stitch by hand. That completes the violet one piece. Here she is. Obviously, this style is never going to be supportive on the bust. It's just how that style is. But I will say I was able to set up my entire lighting and camera room with this on, and I didn't have any sort of slippage. Thank you for watching. Make sure to grab the violet one-piece pattern, and I will see you next time.